This is the only part of the video I can show you because it captures the horrifying moment a father and son were skinned alive by Mexican cartel sicarios. They sat helpless, shirtless, gagged, with their hands tied behind their backs. Then they mercilessly beat the father with a stick as his son watched in pure terror. Then they beheaded the father before torturing the son, flaying his torso and carving out his internal organs. But that's just the beginning, because we're about to uncover some of the most brutal cartel tortures designed to be worse than death.
$20 million for the capture of a diabolical man. Tonight, the feds are putting the pressure on to find the cartel leader who tortured and murdered a local DEA agent.
Back in 2010, a man named Felix sat down for this interview and described what can only be called a living nightmare. He'd been kidnapped by the Zetas, one of Mexico's most ruthless cartels, and held for ransom. His captors wouldn't just beat the crap out of him, they made a show out of it too. For a week straight, gunmen used wooden planks and pistol handles to pummel him, making sure his screams were extra loud when they shocked him with electric currents. This was more than torture. It was part of a negotiation strategy. Every time they called his family to demand ransom, they wanted his suffering to be heard loud and clear. Now, as brutal as that was, Felix wasn't the main attraction here. He said he was forced to watch the Zetas torture rival Gulf cartel members. These people cut off pieces of their bodies bit by bit, day after day, for an entire week. When the victims finally died, their mutilated bodies were burnt to nothing but ash on a mountainside. Felix was in captivity for 2 months, and during that time, he shuffled between 6 different safe houses. In one, he was packed in a tiny, sweltering room with another 80 migrants. In this other one, there were 120 of them. Every single day, people were dragged out one by one to be beaten. At one point, they offered something sickening to Felix: his life in exchange for 12 weeks of hardcore jungle training warfare. And after that, he'd become a full-fledged Zeta member, earning $5,000 a month. The cartel painted it like an opportunity: money, power, survival. But when he asked if he'd ever see his family again, the answer was a clear no. Once you're in, the only way out is through death or prison, maybe. By some miracle, Felix was spared. He was eventually dumped in Reynosa, so battered and swollen he could barely talk, let alone walk. Someone took him to a shelter where he was finally safe, but deeply scarred by what he'd seen and endured. His story is just one of many terrifying examples of how cartel torture can go to its absolute limits, sometimes breaking their victims so completely that death starts to feel a little like mercy. One of the most infamous cases of this kind of torture was that of Enrique Kiki Camarena, a DEA agent captured by the Guadalajara cartel in 1985. For over 30 hours, the cartel had kept him alive while they were torturing him, breaking his ribs, crushing his skull, using a cattle prod to electrocute him. At some point, they had a doctor keep him awake with drugs, and by the time they finally killed him, he'd suffered in most ways people couldn't even imagine. Camarena's murder led to one of the biggest crackdowns on Mexican cartel history. Decades later, torture methods he endured are still being used, perfected even, and broadcasted as warnings. Because for cartels, fear is the ultimate weapon. Now, this particular method of torture favored by cartels is very disturbing. Let us break it down for you. Back in 2020, this video went viral on narco blogs in Mexico, and it shows a man in his 30s who was accused of raping a woman in Mexico City, getting castrated by a pit bull. Instead of locking him up or even killing him outright, members of this violent cartel, La Familia Michoacana, decided to castrate him with a pit bull. I mean, that's a different type of torture there. They would strip him naked, handcuff him, and pin him to the ground with 5 of them surrounding him as the pit bull did its job. And while the man begged for mercy, one sicario covered his mouth with a rag so he couldn't cry out. And then they brought in a second dog to join in on the gruesome act. But that's only one part of the story. Some cartel sicarios, especially near the border, are even more twisted. They target women, both enemies and innocent civilians, with unspeakable acts of sexual violence. The cartel smugglers running hidden networks, ferrying migrants into the U.S., abuse their power to sexually assault women trying to cross the border. The cruelty is so infamous that many mothers in Central America now give their daughters birth control or emergency pills, knowing that sexual violence is almost inevitable on that dangerous journey. Many are raped as soon as they get to their first hiding place or stash house in Mexico. Then they get moved along and assaulted again by another cartel sicario group between locations. Once they reach the border, typically near Reynosa, Mexico, just south of McAllen, Texas, the abuse continues in yet another stash house. Sometimes, if these criminals find them attractive, the operator even assaults them again. They're treated like cargo, stockpiled until the cartel needs needs to use them to move a load of narcotics. After that, the women and girls are driven by another smuggler and a local guide called a coyote to a spot along Highway 281 just before a border patrol checkpoint near Falfurrias, Texas. Migrants are told that this last leg is just a 30-minute hike and are even given a gallon of water, but in reality it could take up to 3 to 4 grueling days, during which the coyote often assaults them again and again. Then, in a sick, twisted ritual, the coyote might even tear off a piece of their clothing and tie it to a tree, infamously called a tree, as a twisted trophy of the abuse. In many cases, the journey takes such a toll that if a woman or a girl is injured, say a sprained ankle, a broken foot, or even collapses out of exhaustion, they're simply abandoned, left there to die. Honestly, this is really a deeply disturbing reality. And this type of torture isn't about ending life or even punishing one. It's about making sure that survivors carry the constant, excruciating reminder of what they've endured, a nightmare that in many ways feels even worse than death. Imagine a really bad bully who not only hurts people, but wants everyone to know that if you break the rules, you might get hurt too. Really, really badly. That's the type of approach some of these cartels take when dealing with their enemies. Take, for example, the December 2020 case of a pregnant woman and 2 men from Guanajuato who were accused of theft. In this horrifying incident, the cartel, said to be the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generacion, or CJNG, employed a method that was as calculated as it was vicious. The process began with the victims being forcibly restrained, ensuring no escape. Then, with a blend of cold precision and raw brutality, they would cut their hands off, and that's done with some crude makeshift tools. The severed limbs weren't immediately discarded. Instead, they're collected and left behind as a gruesome token, a stark warning to anyone who might dare to challenge the cartel's authority. Alongside their amputated hands would be a note that read,
"This happened to me because I was a thief, and because I didn't respect hard-working people, continued to rob them. Anyone who does the same will suffer. Signed, Elite Group."
In another very sad and shocking case, 5 men and 1 woman were found on a road with their hands cut off and the words, "I'm a thief," marked on their foreheads. And the people who would do something like this would like everybody to know that stealing is not acceptable. They even left extra bags containing more hands and a dead body nearby, in case you didn't get the message. Every single detail was to tell you, hey, break the rules, and you'll be punished in a way that hurts you for a very long time. In some cases, they would only cut off 1 hand, but some hitmen go even further, removing both your arms and legs. Could you imagine surviving a devastating attack like this and just live with that permanent reminder? September 26, 2014, around 100 students from the Ayotzinapa Rural Teachers College in Mexico set out on buses, planning to protest at a conference held by Maria de Los Angeles Pineda Villa, the wife of Iguala's mayor, Jose Luis Abarca Velázquez. They wanted to speak out against government corruption and the way rural students were treated unfairly compared to those from the cities. But sadly, they never made it. Before they could get to their destination, police stopped them, and what started like a mere interception quickly turned pretty violent, leading to a shootout that left 6 people dead. And at that moment, the students figured out that they weren't dealing with Mexican police, but cartel sicarios in disguise. The survivors were rounded up, shoved into vehicles, and vanished into the night. By morning, the horrifying truth started to come out. One of the students, Julio Cesar Modragon, was found dead, his eyes gouged out, his face skinned down to the bone, leaving only a bare skull. Now that's pretty freaking disturbing, but even worse would be the flaying that happened years earlier, because on January 2nd, 2010, Hugo Hernandez, 36-year-old from Sonora, was also kidnapped during a wave of cartel violence. His body was later found scattered across Los Mochis, Sinaloa. But what truly horrified authorities was what they found near City Hall. His face, skinned and stitched onto a soccer ball, with a note that read,
"Happy New Year, 'cause this'll be your last."
Authorities believe this murder was a strict message meant to strike fear into rival groups, particularly the Juarez cartel. But here's the terrifying part. That kind of brutality isn't uncommon in Mexico. Flaying, or skinning, is one of the most sadistic torture methods out there that they use. Victims are often still alive when it begins. Sometimes it's just the face, leaving behind a haunting skull-like image meant to terrify anyone who sees it. Other times, entire bodies are skinned, and their enemies are displayed in public as a warning. It's a pretty gory sight to behold. It's not about just killing. It's about control, fear, and sending a message that no one is untouchable.
In a disturbing discovery, Mexican authorities have found 45 bags containing human body parts. The bags were found outside a major city in western Mexico as police connect the discovery of a missing persons case.
In 2015, Texas authorities arrested Marciano Chano Millan Vasquez, a suspected hitman for the Los Zetas cartel. Now, he was linked to a 2013 kidnapping involving a former drug trafficking associate who later testified about the horrifying events he witnessed. According to his account, Vasquez took him to this hidden location where he saw a family, a mother, father, and their young daughter, standing near a burning barrel. The witness claimed that Vasquez and his crew forced the parents to watch as he took an axe and chopped their daughter into pieces, throwing each limb into the flames before turning the weapon on them. Again, cartels don't just kill their victims. They make sure their deaths are drawn out and agonizing. Many are injected with morphine, adrenaline, or even heroin, which keeps them awake during their execution. Once that nervous system is hijacked, the real horror begins. Sicarios use anything from machetes to kitchen knives, carefully slicing through limbs while avoiding major organs, ensuring the victim stays alive long enough to feel every bit of pain. The combination of blood loss, shock, and sheer agony pushes them to the brink, forcing them to reveal any secrets they might be holding. In most cases, the suffering is so intense that death becomes inevitable. One infamous example had to be in October 2010, when a cartel member named Israel Rincon paid the ultimate price for killing the son of one of El Chapo's allies. When El Chapo caught him, he didn't just have him executed, he tortured him until he passed out. But even unconsciousness wasn't an escape, because a doctor was on standby to make sure he stayed alive long enough to suffer even more. Well, his remains were later dumped in Culiacan as another message for his enemies.
They often torture and kill their victims. They have fed some of their victims, dead and alive, to tigers belonging to the Chapitos.
For a very long time, having dangerous, rare, exotic animals has been a flashy way for the ultra-wealthy to show off their status. Over time, cartel bosses would jump on this trend as well, just like the infamous Pablo Escobar, who kept hippos and other wild animals all over his private estate. Pablo was all about wealth, power, and intimidation. Now, authorities in Mexico say these animals weren't just for decoration. Many cartel leaders would use them in the most horrifying ways imaginable, like throwing their victims into cages with starving predators. The sheer terror of facing a slow, gruesome death like that would break any enemy before the animals even got to him. One cartel boss, infamous for using this method, was Heriberto Lascano. Born into poverty on Christmas Day in 1974 in Hidalgo, Mexico, Lascano joined the military at 17. He would serve an elite special forces unit focused on fighting guerrilla groups and drug cartels, and after 7 years in the army, he deserted on March 27, 1998. That's when Ociel Cárdenas Guillén and Arturo Guzman de Sena recruited him into Los Zetas. Lascano, better yet known as Z3 or El Lasca, became one of Mexico's most feared drug lords. Authorities say he was a master of torture, infamous for his cruelty. A signature method of his was called La Paleta, a form of torture where victims were stripped naked and beaten mercilessly with a wooden board. A journalist once reported that Lascano tied a man to a tree, broke his legs with a bat, and left him there for 3 days until he just died. But there's one thing that truly sets him apart, and that was his obsession with wild animals. On his private ranch, he had lions and tigers, not just as pets, but as executioners. While he didn't starve them completely, he kept them just hungry enough so that when he had a victim, they would tear into him instantly. Witnesses say he took pleasure in watching the animals rip apart bodies, even mocking his victims as they screamed for mercy. The CJNG in Mexico has given a whole new meaning to the word brutality. Now, they don't just kill their victims anymore. They force new recruits to eat them. Yikes! Yeah, but before that even happens, victims are tortured, mutilated, and dismembered. It ain't news that the CJNG is one of the biggest and most powerful cartels in Mexico, controlling territories in 35 regions and even operating in Puerto Rico. It's run by a man named Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, and under his rule, they've adopted some of the most extreme, fear-inducing tactics imaginable, including cannibalism. There's actual footage out there showing cartel members standing over the body of a rival from the Sinaloa cartel, once led by El Chapo, the victim's hands tied and his internal organs being devoured as he would take his last breath. And then in the background, another dead body can be seen, while a cartel member casually injures him. Now the CJ&G doesn't just throw its recruits into chaos, they train them for it in secret camps known as escuelas del terror, or terror schools. These aren't just military-style training grounds where they learn how to handle weapons. They're places designed to strip recruits of any last bit of humanity they have, teaching them to know how to torture and kill without hesitation. The cartel needs members to be completely desensitized to violence, and they have some brutal ways of making sure that happens. Since at least 2015, they've been using cannibalism as part of this initiation process. It is a way to test out loyalty and root out anyone who might be an undercover informant. One former recruit talked about how a trainee failed a weapons test and was immediately shot, his body chopped up and fed to the others. There's no room for weakness here. One survivor even described how the most timid recruit in his group was forced to behead a rival and then smash the severed head with a rock. Another recruit vomited while trying to eat parts of a corpse, so the instructors picked it up from the dirt and made him eat it again. To make sure their recruits are completely numb to death, the CJ&G even makes them live with corpses, sharing their barracks with rotting bodies. And they don't keep all this to themselves, they film it. There are videos of recruits eating hearts of their mutilated enemies out there. In this one clip, cartel members can be seen biting into a fresh corpse's heart while mockingly offering pieces back to the victim. Jesus Christ. And honestly, cannibalism isn't common in the cartel world, but the CJ&G has somehow managed to use it as a torture method designed to scare their enemies away and instill regret in the ones who choose to cross dangerous paths with them. Back in 2018, 3 Mexican film students went to Guadalajara to shoot a college project, and while they were there, they would cross paths with a 24-year-old rapper who made a name for himself on YouTube, Christian Omar Palma Gutierrez. But Gutierrez wasn't just out here making music. He was also part of the CJ&G. Now, at first glance, Gutierrez seemed like any other up-and-coming artist, earning between 3,000 to 6,000 pesos a month from his videos, all without even finishing high school. But he had bigger ambitions. He wanted to make it in the music industry and needed more money to support his family. That's how he gets tangled up with the cartel. They pay him 3,000 pesos a week, but not for rapping, for cooking. And no, not in the kitchen, silly. He was in charge of dissolving bodies in acid at a cartel safe house. The process was as gruesome as it sounds. Bodies would be dumped into an acid bath, taking about 2 days to fully dissolve. And once it turns into sludge, Gutierrez would open that drain valve and dump whatever was left into nearby fields. Now, those students we were talking about earlier, all between 20 to 25 years old, had nothing to do with the cartel. They were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. While filming, they unknowingly recorded footage of a house that belonged to a rival cartel, place the CJ&G had been watching closely, and that was enough to seal fate for the worse. The cartel kidnapped them, tortured one of them to death, and when they realized they couldn't release the others, they killed them as well and instructed Gutierrez to cook their remains. That method he used is something called el guiso, which literally means the stew in Spanish. It's a horrific execution and even torture method that they use. No one knows exactly which cartel came up with that nightmare, but it has since become a preferred method of getting rid of bodies. So to make this deadly concoction, we have a massive drum filled with water and concentrated sulfuric acid, causing it to boil violently. When the mixture's ready, victims, often still alive, are submerged in it. The acid eats away at their skin, causing excruciating pain before eventually killing them. One of the most infamous figures to use this method was Santiago Meza Lopez, also known as El Pozolero, the soup maker. He was a cartel cleanup specialist, and authorities believed he dissolved over 300 bodies in acid at his ranch in Ensenada, just 70 miles off the U.S. border. El Pozolero had his own unique style of cooking victims. Sometimes he'd submerge them alive, sometimes he'd dismember them first, but the end result was always the same. While most of these bodies would disintegrate, some parts, like teeth, nails, and small bone fragments, wouldn't fully dissolve. He would then burn them a second time with gasoline before burying the last traces into wastelands. Authorities say he personally got rid of hundreds of bodies this way, dumping what was left into pits in Tijuana. And because it was both a torture method and a way to erase evidence, El Guiso became the go-to executioner for high-ranking cartel bosses. Waterboarding has to be one crazy torture method out there. In Mexico, it's called tehuacanazo, and it's even worse than the original version. The basic idea is pretty simple. It's a cloth placed over the victim's face, and water's poured over it, making it nearly impossible to breathe. The person feels like they're drowning, and in some cases, it can lead to brain damage if prolonged. This torture technique has been around for centuries, used by the Spanish Inquisition, Dutch traders, the Japanese army in World War II, and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. But leave it to the Mexican cartels to take something horrifying enough and just crank it up to an 11. At this point, you already know that these cartels aren't just about violence. They're about making sure their victims really suffer as much as possible. So, instead of regular water, they would use carbonated water, forcing it down the victim's nose. And in the worst cases, they mix in some chili pepper, making it feel like your insides are on fire while you're already struggling to breathe. The wet cloth pressed against the face makes it even more terrifying because as you're choking, that fabric gets heavier, adding to the panic. And they don't just do it once and it's done. Oh, they drag out that suffering, pouring the water in intervals, letting the victim gasp before hitting them with another round. If they just poured it non-stop, the person would pass out or die too quickly. That's not the point here. The point is to break them, to make them feel every second of the torture. We don't know about you, but that's definitely psychological warfare at its worst. During El Chapo's 2019 trial, unsealed court documents revealed a disturbing claim. He once had a doctor revive a man who had passed out from his torture so they could keep torturing him, like we've already talked about. The victim would be Israel Rincon, a member of a rival cartel, and according to the documents, Guzman ordered his men to brutalize this guy after he allegedly tried to kill one of El Chapo's sons. The method of torture was horrific. Electric shocks to the ear, teeth ripped out by force, and the cherry on the cake was to film it all and upload it to YouTube. When it was all over, Rincon's lifeless body was dumped on the streets of Culiacan as a warning. But El Chapo's brutality wouldn't stop with him, of course. His sons, known as Los Chapitos, picked up right where he left off. They didn't just carry on his legacy, they added their own sadistic touches. Like their father, they too used electrocution, but also experimented with other gruesome methods like including corkscrews and hot chiles. Some victims were said to be fed to tigers, sometimes already dead, sometimes still alive. The way it usually went down was ruthless. Los Chapitos would capture rival traffickers, law enforcement officers, or even people they suspected were working with other factions, and they would take them to Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar's ranch in Navolato, Sinaloa, where the interrogation and torture would begin. Once they got what they needed, the victims were executed, and their bodies were dumped in different locations. One of the most disturbing cases was back in 2017, when Los Chapitos captured 2 Mexican federal officers. One was tortured, interrogated, and killed right away. The other, however, was subjected to hours of torment at the hands of the cartel's notorious hit squad, Los Ninis. The sicarios reportedly took a corkscrew and drilled it into the officer's muscles, twisting it, and then shoved hot chiles into his open wounds and nose. After 2 hours of this agony, Ivan Salazar personally executed them. Their bodies were later dumped near a motel close to the ranch. Los Chapitos aren't just following in their father's footsteps. They might be even worse. They've been known to waterboard, dismember, and kill their own associates over something as minor as an unpaid debt. Brand of terror wouldn't be just about power. It's about fear, and they've mastered it in ways even El Chapo himself never imagined.